At 25, she wore England's crown. At 29, she knelt before the axe. Between those dates lies a story of seduction, betrayal, and brutal ambition. She wasn't the first to love a king, but she was the first queen to lose her life for it. And Boleyn's fall wasn't just political, it was personal. And it changed monarchy forever. She arrived at the Tudor court not as a threat, but as a decoration, clever, fashionable, and fluent in French. And Boleyn was no royal, no heiress, no saint. She was a lady-in-waiting with sharp eyes and a sharper tongue, trained in the courts of Mechlin and France, where flirtation was art and ambition a necessity. But when she returned to England around 1522, she was stepping into a world where courtly games turned deadly. King Henry VIII already had a mistress, Anne's sister, Mary Boleyn, and he had a wife, Catherine of Aragon, Queen of England for nearly 2 decades. Their marriage, though once politically powerful, had withered. Catherine had failed to give Henry the one thing he craved, a living male heir. She had birthed a daughter, Mary, but Henry saw no future in a crown worn by a girl. Then came Anne, where Mary Boleyn had offered the king easy charm and offered something else, resistance. She danced, smiled, teased, and refused. She would not be his mistress. If Henry wanted her, he'd have to do the unthinkable, marry her. At first, it was just a game, king's chase, ladies' retreat. But Anne held the line. She wanted more than jewelry and whispered promises. She wanted a crown. And slowly, impossibly, she got under his skin. Henry fell into obsession. By 1527, he was petitioning the Pope to annul his marriage to Catherine. He claimed the union was cursed by God, citing a biblical passage that warned against marrying a brother's widow. Catherine, who had once been married to Henry's older brother Arthur, denied it. She swore she had entered her second marriage a virgin. The court exploded with debate. Bishops, theologians, ambassadors from Spain and Rome, everyone took sides. But Anne waited, and Henry burned. He wrote her dozens of letters, many now preserved. He called her his heart, his jewel, his only love, and she replied, with caution, reminding him of her honor, her virtue, and the promise of what could be if only he made her queen. The years dragged on. The Pope stalled. Catherine refused to yield, and Henry's patience snapped. In 1533, he married Anne Boleyn in secret, a new Archbishop of Canterbury. Thomas Cranmer, conveniently loyal to Henry, declared the king's previous marriage invalid, and was now queen. She was 25 years old. She was crowned with full ceremony at Westminster Abbey. Golden cloth trailed behind her. Roses were scattered in her path. The people, uncertain but obedient, watched as the new queen processed through London, radiant, victorious, pregnant. But not everyone celebrated. To the Catholic world, Anne was a usurper and Henry a heretic. The Pope excommunicated him. England's monasteries and churches began to split. The English Reformation was not born of theology, it was born of lust, politics, and Anne Boleyn's refusal to be mistress, and had won the king's heart, the queen's throne, and the hope of England in her womb. But her crown was made of thorns, because even as the bells rang for her coronation, courtiers whispered, she had better give him a son, she had better keep his attention, she had better survive. The throne had cost her everything. And it would demand more. Because the child growing inside her, destined to shake the world, was not the son Henry prayed for. It was a girl, and from the moment her daughter took her first breath, Anne's clock began ticking toward the block. On September 7, 1533, the future arrived wrapped in crimson cloth and royal silence. Anne Boleyn gave birth to a healthy child at Greenwich Palace, but it was not the long-awaited son. It was a daughter. They named her Elizabeth, for Anne it was both triumph and failure. A living child, yes, but the wrong sex. The court congratulated her with stiff smiles. Henry masked his disappointment. Publicly, he reassured his queen that his sons would follow. Privately, something in him recoiled. He had broken England for this crown, had risked war with Spain, alienated the Catholic Church, and rewritten divine law only to be handed another girl. Still, Anne remained queen. And she was not done fighting. She threw herself into queenship with the same fire that had won Henry's heart. She embraced reformist ideas, supported the translation of the Bible into English, and patronized scholars and poets. She was more than a figurehead, she was a force, sharp-tongued, politically engaged, and unafraid to challenge Henry or his ministers. But the court had changed around her. Catherine of Aragon was gone exiled to remote castles, separated from her daughter Mary, stripped of her title but unyielding. In dignity, the people still whispered her name with reverence, and those who hated and the nobles loyal to Catherine, the old Catholic families. The foreign ambassadors waited for her to falter. Even her former allies began to drift. Thomas Cromwell, once her supporter, grew wary of her influence. The Seymour family, quiet and calculating, watched from the shadows. Then came the miscarriages. In 1534, and lost a second child. In 1535, another. Each failure echoed louder than the last, and each time, Henry grew colder. His affections shifted, and, once the sun around which he revolved, became an object of frustration. Her wit, once charming, now grated. Her independence, once thrilling, now seemed insolent. The final blow came in January 1536, and was pregnant again. Hope returned for her, for Henry, for their fractured future. But then news came. Catherine of Aragon had died. England's former queen was gone now, and could be recognized universally as the sole rightful queen. She wore yellow in court, a color of celebration in Tudor custom, but many saw it as tasteless, as if she danced on Catherine's grave. Still, and pressed on until just days later, she suffered a devastating miscarriage. She had been carrying a boy. Henry did not hide his disappointment this time. He spoke openly of divine judgment, of cursed marriages. The whispers returned. Had he made a mistake? Had God withdrawn his favor? And more dangerously, was there someone else who could do better? Her enemies moved quickly. Jane Seymour, quiet and pale, now wore the king's gaze. Cromwell, ever the survivor, began distancing himself from Anne's faction. And Henry, he began speaking in terms and had only ever used for others' annulment, removal, justice. The woman who had once been untouchable now walked a palace, where every door closed faster than it opened. And Anne knew it. Her body had failed her. Her enemies had outflanked her. And her husband, once willing to burn a kingdom for her, now barely looked her in the eye. She still wore the crown. She still sat beside the throne. But beneath the jewels, the blade was already being sharpened. Because in Henry's court, queens were not divorced. They were destroyed. And Boleyn could feel it. The change in the air, the sudden hush when she entered a room, the unreadable expressions on faces that once beamed in her presence. She had seen it before, how Catherine had been quietly dismantled, not with open attack but with careful erosion. Now it was happening to her. But it was not Catherine. She would not retreat in silence. She would fight. What Anne didn't know was that the wheels of her destruction were already turning, and not in public, but in shadow. Thomas Cromwell, the king's principal secretary and master strategist, had grown tired of Anne's interference. Once allies in religious reform, their relationship had soured over power and influence, and had criticized Cromwell's handling of monastic dissolutions. Worse, she had attempted to undermine his foreign diplomacy. She challenged him in council, mocked him in private, and fatally underestimated his reach. By April 1536, Cromwell had decided, and Boleyn must fall. The plan was not just to remove her, it was to obliterate her legacy. No simple annulment would suffice. She must be made monstrous. It began with rumors, whispers that Anne had not only flirted beyond courtly limits but had committed adultery with multiple men, including her brother, George Boleyn, Viscount Rochford. The charges were grotesque, almost unbelievable, which made them perfect. The more shocking the lie, the less likely it is to be questioned. Anne's enemies collected names: Mark Smeaton, a court musician; Sir Henry Norris, the king's groom; of the stool, Sir Francis Weston, William Brereton, and George Boleyn, all respected, all close to Anne, and all easy targets. On April 30th, Mark Smeaton was arrested and tortured. He confessed, likely under unbearable pressure, to an affair with the Queen. Others were seized days later. Most denied the accusations. It didn't matter. On May 2nd, Anne was summoned to the Tower. She arrived not as a queen, but as a prisoner. escorted past the same gates through which Catherine's household had once exited. She was told the charges: adultery, incest, treason. Her world, already fragile, collapsed. She swore her innocence. She demanded an audience with the king. But Henry remained distant, cold, and silent, his affections fully transferred to Jane. Seymour Dodden was confined in the Queen's lodgings, the very rooms built for her coronation 3 years earlier. She wept, prayed, raged. Her mood swung between disbelief and defiance. She wrote to Henry, begging for mercy or at least a fair hearing. Her words went unanswered. And outside, her enemies crafted a trial. Cromwell orchestrated the proceedings. With surgical cruelty, witnesses were manipulated. Evidence was fabricated. The accused men were tried and convicted with stunning speed. Their sentences: death. George Boleyn was given the cruelest fate. Accused of incest with his sister, he stood trial knowing his execution would bring not only his end but Anne's. His defense was articulate and courageous but futile. On May 15th, Anne herself was brought before a jury of peers. The Duke of Norfolk presided, her own uncle. The verdict was preordained: guilty. She was sentenced to be burned or beheaded at the king's discretion, and reportedly laughed, not from joy, but disbelief. She had been condemned by the very machine she had once commanded, and now it was feeding on her. But even as the date of execution approached, one final detail had yet to be decided, because Henry wanted a foreign executioner, a swordsman from Calais, not for mercy, but for spectacle. And Anne, kneeling in her cold chamber, began to realize she would not die quickly. She would die carefully, publicly, perfectly, because Tudor executions weren't about punishment, they were about performance. May 19, 1536, the sky above the Tower of London was unusually clear, as if the heavens themselves refused to mourn, and Boleyn rose early that morning. She dressed with care, choosing a dark gray gown trimmed with crimson, a color not just of royalty, but of martyrdom. She wore a simple headdress, and underneath it, her dark hair was swept back. There would be no crown today, only composure. She had been told her execution would be carried out by a swordsman from Calais, specially summoned at the king's request. A rare courtesy, though no one could decide if it was meant as kindness or a final theatrical flourish. Regardless, and clung to the promise of precision. An axe could fail, a sword would not. As she was led from her chambers to the scaffold, she passed familiar halls once filled with music and politics and laughter, now silent. Outside, the crowd waited. Nobles, guards, and commoners alike had come to watch the fall of a queen. She had been their monarch. Now she was a spectacle, and mounted the scaffold alone. Her accused lovers were already dead, executed 2 days earlier in grim succession. George Boleyn, her brother, had spoken boldly at his end, and would do the same. She turned to the crowd and spoke with terrifying calm. She did not protest her innocence. She did not curse her enemies. Instead, she prayed for the king, a gentle and sovereign lord. It was not surrender, it was a strategy. In Tudor England, dying with grace could restore honor more effectively than living with shame. She knelt, blindfolded, and whispered her final prayers. The executioner stepped forward, sword hidden behind his back, and then a distraction. The swordsman shouted to his assistant for the weapon. As Anne turned her head instinctively toward the sound, the blade flashed in from the other direction. One clean stroke. It was over in seconds. Her head was placed in a straw-filled basket. Her body remained slumped on the scaffold until it, too, was removed. No elaborate coffin, no royal tomb. She was buried in an arrow chest, a wooden box beneath the floor of the chapel of St. Peter ad Vincula inside the tower. No name marked the spot. No stone was carved. She vanished as swiftly as she had risen. But Anne's execution didn't silence the court. It unsettled it. Some nobles wept. Some watched in stunned silence. And some, the clever ones, took note of the speed. From arrest to death, it had taken just 17 days. To fast for justice. Perfect timing for a political reset. Because even as Anne's body cooled, her replacement waited in the wings. Jane Seymour, quiet and obedient, was already being fitted for her wedding dress. 11 days after Anne's death, Henry VIII married. Jane, no mourning, no reflection, only movement forward as if it had never existed. But England had changed. The Reformation and helped birth was now irreversible. Her daughter Elizabeth, just 2 years old, was declared illegitimate, removed from the line of succession. Yet she remained alive, watching and learning from afar. Anne's enemies thought they had ended her, but what they didn't know was that history is not written in silence, that it's written by survival. And the little girl left behind, the one born in disappointment, would one day return with fire in her blood and vengeance in her crown. And Boleyn's body was gone, but her presence refused to fade. She had vanished from court, from the king's favor, and from the records that once sang her praises, but she lingered in the most dangerous place of all, memory. And memories, in Tudor England, could be just as fatal as facts. For King Henry VIII, Anne's death was meant to be closure. With her gone, he could rewrite the past, declare her a mistake, a seductress who had bewitched him into disaster. Her name was scraped off jewels, her initials, carved beside Henry's on palace walls, were replaced or covered. Those who had once served her now distanced themselves, aligning with Queen Jane Seymour. History was moving on, or so it seemed, but ghosts have a way of walking through locked doors. Only 11 days after Anne's execution, Henry married Jane. The contrast was immediate. Where Anne had been sharp, Jane was soft. Where Anne had demanded attention, Jane deferred. She gave the king peace but not passion. The court was quieter, but underneath the calm, Anne's shadow stretched longer than anyone dared admit. Whispers remained. Had Anne truly committed adultery? Why were the charges so absurd? Incest, multiple lovers, plotting the king's death with a musician. Why had the trials moved so quickly? Why had the sword been summoned before the verdict? The nobility never asked these questions aloud, but they remembered. And in private, they wondered if a queen could be killed simply for falling from favor. It was a lesson that would haunt every woman who came after. Jane Seymour bore Henry the son he always wanted. Edward just over a year into their marriage, but she died shortly after childbirth. The queen who replaced Anne was praised for her obedience, her purity, and her sacrifice, but she left no legacy of power, only a child and a funeral. In contrast, Anne had given Henry a daughter who had survived disgrace, exile, and the erasure of her mother's name, Elizabeth. As Anne's memory was erased from the court, Elizabeth was quietly reduced to a political inconvenience, declared illegitimate, stripped of her status, moved from palace to palace, always watched, always contained, but never silenced. She was her mother's daughter, intelligent, proud, observant, and from the age of 3, she understood what the crown could do to women, how it could raise and destroy them in a single breath. Anne had died with dignity, but the fire that had once lived in her eyes now lived in Elizabeth's, not in defiance. In patience, Elizabeth watched as Henry married again, and again, and again. Catherine Howard, another young queen, was executed for adultery just 5 years after Anne. The similarities were chilling: youth, beauty, a court that turned on them. Catherine, like Anne, was accused of moral impurity and paid for it with her head, and had been the precedent. Now others followed. But Anne's legacy wasn't just a curse. It became a pattern. Every queen that followed wore their crown with caution. Every daughter of power knew what could happen when ambition met a throne. And Elizabeth, growing into a young woman in a kingdom of shifting alliances and shattered marriages, never forgot. She would not repeat her mother's mistakes. She would never place her fate in a man's hands, because Boleyn had taught her something no tutor ever could. In the court of Henry VIII, love was fleeting, loyalty was currency, and survival required more than birthright. It required strategy. And one day, the daughter of the beheaded queen would return not as a pawn, but as a storm. Elizabeth Tudor had no crown, no title, and no clear future, but she had one priceless inheritance, her mother's fire. And Boleyn had been silenced, but her legacy burned inside the girl she left behind. And as England staggered from one queen to the next, Elizabeth learned to walk silently through storm and shadow, never forgetting what had happened to the last woman who stood tall. By the time Elizabeth was 10, she had already buried more queens than most monarchs would ever meet. Her mother, Anne, was executed, Jane Seymour dead in childbirth, Anne of Cleves, divorced and exiled, Catherine Howard, beheaded like her cousin Anne, and finally, Catherine Parr Kind, educated and clever, who survived Henry but died not long after marrying again. Elizabeth absorbed it all, not just the deaths, but the politics behind them. She saw how charm failed, how obedience offered no shield, how being too quiet or too outspoken could both lead to ruin. But rather than shrink, she adapted. She mastered languages: Latin, French, Italian, and Greek. She devoured history and philosophy. She trained her face to reveal nothing, her voice to say just enough. Every move became calculated. She would not be remembered as the daughter of disgrace. She would rewrite the name Boleyn into something unshakable, but it wouldn't come easily. After Henry VIII's death in 1547, England passed into the hands of his only legitimate son, Edward VI. Jane Seymour's child, Elizabeth, just 13, became a quiet fixture in the royal household. She watched from the sidelines as Edward's regents plunged the country deeper into Protestant reform. Religion, politics, and power swirled into violent storms, and Elizabeth, again, remained still. Then came the turning point. In 1553, Edward died, 16 years old. No heir, no plan. What followed was chaos. Lady Jane Grey, Elizabeth's cousin, was declared queen briefly. She lasted 9 days before being overthrown by Mary Tudor, Catherine of Aragon's daughter, and Elizabeth's older half-sister. Mary became queen, and England changed overnight. Protestantism was outlawed, heretics were burned, and Elizabeth, seen as both a Protestant and a potential rival, was placed under constant suspicion. Mary had every reason to distrust her. Elizabeth was young, beautiful, and popular. More dangerous still, she was silent. She refused to denounce her mother. She refused to renounce her Protestant faith. And she refused to confess to any plot against the Queen. But that didn't stop Mary from imprisoning her in the Tower of London, the same tower wherein Boleyn had waited for death. For Elizabeth, the cold stone walls were more than a prison. They were a prophecy. She had always known her mother died here. Now she walked the same halls, slept beneath the same roof, faced the same silence, and yet she refused to break. She prayed, she wrote, she played the part of the loyal subject, offering obedience without weakness, submission without surrender. She knew any wrong word could mean execution, but she also knew this: Mary had no children, no heir, and the people were watching. When Elizabeth was finally released from the tower, she emerged not defeated, but hardened. She returned to court with the same strategy her mother once wore like armor: presence, grace, calculation. But unlike Anne, Elizabeth did not demand love. She demanded patience, because her time was coming. And when the flames of Mary's reign finally burned themselves out, and the throne stood empty once more, there would be only one name whispered through England's: Carter's, the daughter of Anne Boleyn. The girl was born in disgrace, the storm that had learned to wait. In November 1558, the bells of London tolled for Queen Mary. England's first reigning queen was dead, childless, mourned by few, and remembered mostly for the flames that consumed her enemies. The crown she fought so bitterly to secure now passed to her greatest threat, the half-sister she once imprisoned in the Tower. Elizabeth Tudor, the daughter of Anne Boleyn, was 25 years old, the same age her mother had been when crowned. But unlike Anne, Elizabeth wore the crown by blood, not marriage, not through seduction, but survival. On a cold, mist-covered morning, she rode into London not as a pawn, but as monarch. The people lined the streets, shouting her name, reaching for her gloved hands, whispering prayers of hope. They didn't just see a queen, they saw redemption. They saw the child once stripped of legitimacy now riding beneath the canopy of state. Golden hair crowned with Tudor fire dot, but beneath the velvet and jewels, Elizabeth carried a heavier weight. One Anne had never been allowed to bear, power without protection, and Boleyn had been queen by marriage, dependent on Henry's shifting affections. Elizabeth ruled by divine right. She needed no husband to ascend the throne. But that independence came with its curse. Within weeks, Parliament and ambassadors flooded her with one urgent demand: Mary, secure the line, choose a prince, give England a king. But Elizabeth had already seen what marriage did to queens. It broke them, silenced them, killed them. She refused. She spoke in riddles. She promised to consider suitors, entertained negotiations with France, Spain, and the Holy Roman Empire. But she never chose, not because she hated love, but because she had watched her mother die from it. Instead, Elizabeth chose the crown, and she wore it unlike any ruler before her. She walked the line between power and femininity with precision. She charmed her council, commanded her armies, and navigated religious division with terrifying intelligence. Protestants saw her as a reformer. Catholics saw her as illegitimate, but none could ignore her. She made herself mythic, the Virgin. Queen married not to a man, but to her kingdom. Portraits painted her as timeless, ageless, divine. Her words, carefully chosen, became gospel. And in every hall, in every cathedral, in every corner of Europe, the name Elizabeth echoed with awe. But she never forgot the path that led her there. She restored Anne Boleyn's honor quietly, never openly rewriting the past, but steadily reinforcing her legitimacy. She kept her mother's memory alive through gestures, appointments of loyal Boleyn kin, preservation of portraits, and subtle references in court. She never spoke Anne's name in speeches. She didn't need to. Her very existence was a living monument to the woman England had tried to erase, and yet Anne remained wound beneath the crown. Elizabeth trusted few. She remained unmarried. She resisted emotional entanglement. Some say it was pride. Others say it was a strategy. But beneath it all was fear, the kind only a daughter of execution could understand. To love was to be vulnerable. To marry was to gamble with survival. So she didn't. And for 45 years, she ruled longer than any Tudor monarch before her. She turned England into a naval power, navigated plots, betrayals, assassinations, and war. She outlived her enemies. She witnessed the deaths of rivals and would-be usurpers. She watched nations fall, but each time she stood before her people, her voice calm, her eyes sharp. One truth remained: she had done what her mother never could, not because she was better, but because she had learned to be alone. And as her reign soared, one question remained unanswered. Would history remember Anne as the scandal, or as the spark that set a queen ablaze? Even as Queen Elizabeth I basked in glory, crowned in the faith and loyalty of her subjects, she ruled a court riddled with ghosts. The greatest of these was not a threat from abroad, nor a rebellion within. It was the past. The very foundation of her monarchy was built atop the broken body of a woman the world had tried to forget. But Anne Boleyn would not vanish. Elizabeth knew it. She had lived it. She had been branded a bastard, banished, and ignored, all because of the fate her mother suffered under Henry's sword. Now, as queen, she carried Anne's memory in every calculated breath she took. And yet, in public, she rarely spoke of her. There were no grand declarations, no monuments, no open tributes. But in her private chambers, Anne's presence lingered. There were reports of Elizabeth keeping a ring with a secret compartment inside. 2 miniatures, one of herself and one believed to be of Anne. It was not a public relic. It was a personal talisman, a whisper to herself that she had not forgotten where she came from, and at what cost. Elizabeth's decisions, her politics, her manner, her resistance to marriage were more than just statecraft. They were defense mechanisms forged in childhood trauma and had been destroyed by love, stripped of power by proximity to a king. Elizabeth would never let that happen to her. Her refusal to marry was both symbolic and tactical. Every suitor, every treaty, was weighed against the knowledge that queens who gave their hearts often lost their heads. Even in the glittering world of her golden court, danger crept beneath the surface. Plots swirled around her. Catholics viewed her as a heretic and usurper. Spain longed to see her deposed. Her cousin, Mary Queen of Scots, posed an ever-present threat, a rival claimant with Catholic support. Elizabeth's enemies saw her reign as illegitimate, not just because of religion, but because of Anne. To erase Elizabeth, they first had to rewrite her mother. The irony was brutal. Anne had died to make Elizabeth queen. Now, that legacy threatened. Her daughter's life daily. In 1586, the Babington plot, a conspiracy to assassinate Elizabeth and place Mary Stuart on the throne, was uncovered. It forced Elizabeth to make the most agonizing decision of her reign, to execute her cousin. Mary's death in 1587 was not just political, it was personal. It mirrored Anne's end too closely. A queen was brought to trial, a woman condemned by the court, an execution cloaked in legality, but bleeding with symbolism. Elizabeth never watched the execution. She didn't even sign the warrant until pressed, but once it was done, she carried the weight in silence. To queens both tied by blood, both bound by crowns, had now fallen to the blade. Elizabeth had survived, but she knew better than anyone. Survival was not the same as peace. In her later years, Elizabeth grew more isolated. She surrounded herself with loyalists, but trusted few. She walked palace halls that once echoed with Anne's footsteps. She spoke to portraits more than people. And through it all, her resolve hardened into legend. She never married, never bore an heir, never named a successor until the end. Because to her, the crown was not a symbol of lineage. It was a grave. And as she aged, one question haunted her, whispered in the quiet hours of dusk. Had she truly escaped her mother's fate? Or had she simply mastered the art of delay? Because in the Tudor world, power was never permanent, and the ghosts never stopped watching. In the final decade of her reign, Queen Elizabeth I stood as an icon, unchallenged, unwed, and unshaken. Her portraits painted her in white lead and gold leaf, eternal and untouchable. But the truth behind the canvas was far less divine. Her hair, once flaming red, had thinned and grayed. Her teeth had rotted. Her beloved advisors, one by one, had died. And in their absence, something darker filled the silence. That loneliness. Her court still bowed and praised her, still hailed her as Gloriana, the Virgin Queen. But behind closed doors, whispers grew. She had no heir, no husband, no children. The Tudor line was dying with her, and still, she refused to name a successor. Power had made her mythic, but it had also made her mortal in ways no one could see. To name a successor was to admit the end was near, and Elizabeth had spent her whole life outrunning endings. But time, like the crown, is merciless. As she entered her 60s, Elizabeth began to retreat from court life. She wandered through her palaces, restless and unsleeping. Her servants noted how she stood in the cold, refusing warmth, how she paced for hours, whispering to herself, as if the ghosts of her past had finally come calling. She wept openly for Essex, her former favorite, executed after leading a rebellion. His death broke something in her, perhaps the last fragile connection she had to the youthful, defiant girl she once was. And always, in the corners of her mind, was Anne. She had survived the same tower, outlived the men who branded her illegitimate, reigned for 45 years over a nation that had once tried to erase her. But the shadow of her mother was still there, not as a scandal, but as a question. Was it worth it? Elizabeth had won every battle, but sacrificed everything to do so. She had watched the world change from her throne, but remained untouched by it. No family, no legacy of flesh, only policies, portraits, and the echo of a name that began as disgrace and ended as divinity. In March 1603, Elizabeth fell ill. The doctors called it melancholy. She refused to take to her bed, as if lying down would be a surrender she could never undo. For days she stood, refusing food, refusing comfort. When her strength failed, she collapsed onto cushions in her chamber, unmoving, silent, draped in black. Her closest attendants surrounded her in prayer, waiting for words she never gave. Finally, after days of silence, she gestured weakly toward a name. James VI of Scotland, son of Mary Stuart, the cousin whom Elizabeth had executed. A man, raised away from the poison of the English court, but descended from Tudor blood through his grandmother, Margaret. The crown would pass to him, ending the Tudor line forever. On March 24, 1603, Elizabeth died. There were no children to weep for her, no husband to declare mourning, only a country stunned by the loss of its longest-reigning monarch. The Virgin Queen was gone, but she did not vanish. She became a legend. Elizabeth I was buried in Westminster Abbey, but not alone. Years later, when the tomb of her half-sister Mary was disturbed, Elizabeth's coffin was placed above it. The two daughters of Henry VIII, Catherines, Child and Anne's lay together in death, though they had warred in life. Their shared grave bears an inscription in Latin, partners in throne and grave. Here we sleep, Elizabeth and Mary. Yet nowhere on the tomb is in Boleyn's name, because her story, though finished in flesh, remained unfinished in stone. But that was the mistake history made, because Anne's greatest revenge was not survival. It was a legacy. The legacy of Anne Boleyn did not end with her execution, nor with Elizabeth's final breath. It was etched deeper into the laws, the letters, the language of England itself. From the day Anne walked into Henry's court to the hour her daughter died as queen, the very nature of monarchy had changed. No longer was the crown simply inherited. It could be seized, challenged, molded by ambition, and paid for in blood. Elizabeth's death in 1603 marked the end of the Tudor dynasty. With no direct heir, the throne passed to James VI of Scotland. Uniting the crowns of England and Scotland under one monarch, James was not only the son of Mary, Queen of Scots, but also the great-grandson of Henry VII, a Stuart, not a Tudor. The age of Elizabeth had closed, but the question remained, how should it be remembered? For decades, monarchs had treated Anne Boleyn's name like poison. After her death, Henry ensured her legacy was buried physically and figuratively. Her portraits were destroyed, her titles revoked, her supporters scattered. The Catholic world branded her a temptress, a whore, a witch. Even Protestant allies kept her memory in shadow, afraid of reopening old wounds. But Elizabeth had slowly, strategically reversed that. Not with declarations, with symbolism. She had revived the falcon badge, Anne's personal emblem. She had worn Boleyn jewels in private, and perhaps most notably, she had ruled in a way that mirrored her mother's boldness, but refined it into discipline. Where Anne had challenged the court with wit, Elizabeth dismantled it with silence. Where Anne had demanded love, Elizabeth demanded loyalty. She had taken the fire that killed her mother and forged it into armor. And yet, even after her death, Anne Boleyn's story refused to stay buried. In the centuries that followed, historians would dig through court records, letters, and trial transcripts. They'd find contradictions, lies. Scripts were written to fit a narrative that served Henry's need for a clean break. Anne had been accused of adultery with 5 men, including her own brother, yet no witnesses had seen it. No evidence had supported it. 2 of the supposed lovers were not even in the same location as in during the times alleged. It wasn't justice. It was an assassination disguised as law, and over time, that truth crept back into public consciousness. Writers, artists, and scholars began to see Anne not as a villain, but as a victim. Not a temptress, but a visionary. Not a scandal, but a signal of change. By the 19th century, the Victorians had all but romanticized her. Books were written. Paintings imagined her last moments with solemn grandeur. Plays portrayed her as England's fallen rose. And in the 20th century, with the rise of modern feminism and reevaluations of royal history, Anne's image sharpened again, not as martyr or monster, but as a woman who dared to reach for power in a world that had no room for her. And in many ways, Elizabeth's reign became Anne's true monument. Under Elizabeth, England had grown from a fractured, bankrupt island to a global power. It had faced down the Spanish Armada, navigated religious chaos, and birthed an era of cultural flourishing now known as the English Renaissance. Anne's blood had done that, not through sword or sermon, but through survival. The most terrifying thing about Anne Boleyn wasn't that she seduced a king. It's that she gave England the queen it needed, not the one it expected. A woman who defied her fate. A daughter who became a dynasty. A name once whispered in shame is now etched in glory. But the tragedy lingers. Anne died believing her daughter would be forgotten. Elizabeth died, never speaking her mother's name aloud in public. Their lives were bound by silence and spectacle, by crowns that lifted and crushed them both. And the world almost let that silence stand. Today, visitors to the Tower of London can walk the path and took to her death. They can stand over the unmarked grave, where her body was hurriedly buried in a chest too small. But they can also visit Westminster Abbey, where Elizabeth lies in state beneath golden effigies. A queen remembered for power and peace. Between the tower and the abbey, between the executioner's blade and the royal tomb, lies the true story of England's transformation, a story written by two women, one erased, one exalted, and yet both queens. Because, in the end, Anne Boleyn was not destroyed, she was distilled. Her daughter proved it. Her legacy confirmed it. And every time the crown sits atop a woman's head, whether in England or beyond, it echoes with the voice of a woman who once refused to kneel, not because she was perfect, but because she dared to rise, even knowing the blade was already being forged.